Hi everybody, my name is Tanya Pobeda and I am going to give you a quick presentation overview of a presentation I'm about to give later in the week. This is a work in progress. This is subject to peer review. These are some very preliminary findings from my PhD dissertation, and I'm a PhD candidate at Ryerson and York University. This presentation is entitled, "I Didn't See Anyone Who Looked Like Me, Gender and Racial Representation in Board Gaming." Now, conducting this analysis, I'm using a intersectional framework, a lens with which you look at things like gender, race, ethnic identity, and different dimensions like disability, socioeconomic status, um, immigration status, and how that changes the way you're perceived in certain communities, how you walk through the world, how much privilege you have. And originally, Dr. Crenshaw created this framework to look at the justice system. Um, and here's a quote from Dr. Crenshaw. "Intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects." So I'm using this framework to look at the board gaming sector as a labor practice, as well as a cultural practice. And how does the dimensions of gender and race play out in that board gaming community? So I, like a lot of board game enthusiasts, watched with close attention during the summer months of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, um, and watched as so many spheres of North American and global sectors, industry sectors, and cultural practice groups really had a racial reckoning, really confronted the issue of systemic racism in their systems and in their communities. And June 10th, 2020, was a day I watched with very close attention as some of the biggest names in board gaming spoke out about the lack of strong, supportive statements from key industry groups and convention organizers specifically about Black Lives Matter. They were looking for a statement. And on June 10th, multiple important voices in the board gaming community pulled out of Origins Online, a massive convention in the board gaming space. People like Eric Lang, prolific and award-winning designer, Mandy Hutchinson, who is a content creator that I really enjoy and is a leading voice on the topic of gender and racial challenges in the board gaming hobby, as well as Elizabeth Hargrave. And so they announced that they were going to be pulling out of the convention, as did many others. And as a result, the Origins Online conference was canceled. So what I'm looking at is, some of the dynamics that involve gender and race in board gaming. And first, I wanted to take a look at the labor of board gaming. And this is some of my preliminary findings based on a poll, a database poll of the top 400 Board Game Geek games. And what I discovered is similar to a 2018 study I published in the Analog Game Studies Journal. There is a stark disparity in terms of the game design labor that goes into the top ranked board games. So in this case, it was a top 400 Board Game Geek ranked games. And what I found was white men, designers, were basically representative of 92.6% of all of the game design labor that goes into those 400 games. White women at 3.3% that's a very small percentage of that mix, and BIPOC men were 4.1%. So I think you'll agree with me that this is a pretty stark disparity when you're looking at a particular labor group and finding these kinds of numbers. It's really quite shocking. So this was a comment that I actually got from a participant of an online survey that I conducted that started on in August 2020 and ran till just near the end of October 2020. And this was just a comment in response to the question about game design. And here it is. "Our local board game convention is whiter than Wonder Bread, and the game designer club I attend has an all-male attendance 95% of the time." So that was kind of an interesting comment and very similar to a lot of other comments that I got. The other thing that I looked at was artwork. So board game artwork. What might you be confronted with when you pick up a board game and you're thinking about making a play or purchase decision? And what I found in painstakingly auditing all of the board game artwork across 200 Board Game Geek ranked games is there's a very stark disparity about BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and persons of color um, representation. So artwork that presents in a way that would appear to be BIPOC, and white. And I have very strict definitions for how that's defined in the dissertation. And what I discovered was 82.5% of the human representation that I found on the cover boxes were white presenting, and only 17.5% were BIPOC in any way, so classifiably Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. So a scant 112 figures compared to 528 figures that were white presenting. Now, one of the things that I am leaving to one side, but I wanted to caveat here, is when I'm doing these kinds of audits, I'm strictly counting. I'm not looking at positive versus negative representation, and I include these two cards, or actually 3 cards in here, just as an example of the kind of representation you might encounter when you find BIPOC imagery in a game. So here's an example of what is said to be hackers. And I think that you might agree with me that this may not be considered a particularly positive representation of young Asian presenting men. So they're entitled hacker, and it says in the flavor text, very unethical, very illegal, very lucrative. Okay, here's another example, and this is not to pick on Terraforming Mars, but just a sample of the kind of representation that I might encounter, but I'm not making a value judgment in terms of whether that's positive or negative, because that's a study for another time. This is an example of an indentured worker in this particular game, and I think you'll agree with me that the idea is problematic as a thematic notion, and this particular choice of cover art or stock photo in this case is not a terrific one. And similarly, here's another example card. So I'm sort of pushing that to one side, but I wanted to flag that just as in the interest of full disclosure. Now, the other thing about cover art is there is a stark disparity of men versus women characters, so feminine or masculine presenting characters on the cover art. And in this case, 76.8% of all of the figures that I audited were male presenting, men, boys, and only 23.2% were women of any kind, young women, and this was an aggregate across the racial dimension. So this was another comment that I got, that occasionally players, and this is an online survey of board game players, encounter female characters, but they're not always dressed appropriately. So in this particular comment, this individual is saying, I really wish clothing on female characters was more appropriate for the tasks and roles of the characters, i.e. warriors should not be bikini clad, adventurers should not be wearing stiletto heels with mini skirts and corsets, etc. So this was another response from an active, avid board gamer saying, gee, I really wish people would be dressed more appropriately. And here's an example of a piece of artwork where this person is going into battle. And I think you might agree with me, this is probably not, particularly good battle garb. So another thing I found, and I'm very much indebted to a terrific study that was done by Erin Davis in 2016. And what she discovered was you're more likely to see an image of a sheep than you would an image of a woman. And I found something similar, but in this case, an aggregate number of aliens, or fantastic creatures, which are things like dragons, orcs, goblins, elves, that kind of thing, something you might not encounter in reality, or an alien like a gray. You're more likely to find an image of that than you would an image of a woman. So women figures were numbered in about 184, whereas aliens or fantastic creatures numbered 231 across those 200 board games that I audited. And the other troubling finding that I found was there was such a diminishingly small number of BIPOC presenting female characters. 35 to be exact, across many hundreds of human representations. And so in this case, you're more likely to see an image of a bird on a cover of these top 200 board games than you would a BIPOC woman. So one of the things, as I alluded to earlier, is I gathered a lot of player perspectives. And by any measure, the participants of the online survey that I conducted in August of 2020, these individuals were avid, dedicated board gamers. I specifically asked that particular type of question to find out, how committed are they to the hobby? How often are they gaming? And, are they avid purchasers as well of gaming? Because I really wanted to find out what are the direct implications of absent or negative representation in board gaming. And what I discovered is some pretty staggering numbers. So in this particular instance, I was in marketing for a really long time, and I have to tell you that when people have this high level of strong agreement with a statement, that means there's something really going on in that community. So in this case, and this was a very, very high finding, I gave a statement and people were asked to rank their agreement with that statement. And what I got was 61.9% strongly agreeing that the board gaming hobby is dominated by white men. 27.7% agreed. So you're seeing numbers that are over 89% agreement with this statement. And I thought that was a very, very compelling finding. The statement, positive gender and racial representation in game enhances my enjoyment while playing a game, also got very, very high levels of agreement. So strongly agree, 60.4%. That's a very, very high finding, a passionate kind of finding. This is connoting kind of an enthusiasm or a passion for that particular statement. And agreement was 24.5%, which brings us almost to 85% agreement. Again, a very, very high finding. Another example statement was seeing my gender identity represented in board gaming, artwork, playable characters is important to me. And we got lower levels of agreement with strongly agree at 39% and 28% agreeing, still very high, 70% agreement. And it's quite uncommon to see this kind of passion in these kinds of statements. And this is just a very small cross-section of my study. I wish game publishers would ensure their board game artwork, etc., had more equitable racial representation. And here we see extremely high levels of agreement at 85%, with passion indicated in the strongly agree at 57.9%. So again, this is quite significant. Now, this is just a taste of the PhD dissertation that I'm working on right now. There is much, much more in it. This is just a quick cross-section of my work to kind of show you how the work is going. But I did want to share it because, I'm noticing I monitor a lot of social media, and there's a lot of discussion happening right now. I'm noticing that there is a significant amount of bravery and advocacy happening in the board gaming space. It can be very, very difficult to speak about these matters because you often get backlash. And I actually maintain on my computer a thing I call the troll file, where these are real comments that I've gotten from real board gamers, and in some cases maybe not such active board gamers, but a lot of people indicating that they are. And sometimes my research, which is very empirical in nature, and I attempt to be very dispassionate, is met with a lot of anger. So here's a couple of examples of the kinds of comments that I have gotten in the past. So this individual wrote, I'm a fanatical board game player. This woman, me, is nuts. Many games have a European historic theme, so to be authentic, you pretty much have to leave out, and this is kind of offensive, the left-handed Burmese lesbians. Okay. This is another one. Hey, dumbass researcher, just tell the underrepresented groups to design their own games. If they don't choose to, then maybe you want to stop wasting time and taxpayer money doing stupid and pointless studies. And one of the things I will share with you is I get no money doing any of these studies. This is unfunded research, and I'm doing it, not in my copious spare time. I'm doing it while I'm going to full-time school, and obviously doing it in service of my PhD dissertation, but I'm not being paid to do this work. And this is someone who's purposely misspelling my name. Newsflash Batumba, North America, American, in this case typo, is predominantly white, whose people live in a free land bought and paid for generations of blood. And I see this kind of comment quite a bit. And, previous research studies have been picked up in right-wing outlets, which was not particularly fun for me. Here's an example of one of the headlines: leftist research decries lack of diversity in board games, demands change. And this one, Daily Caller, board games don't do enough to reflect the diversity of America's population, which is true. But it was in the Daily Caller and was not a particularly fun experience for me. The point here being that a lot of this kind of analytic work, this empirical work, is often not met with a lot of friendly remarks. And there's a real pushback, a backlash around the kind of advocacy we're seeing in board games and against researchers like myself. So I wanted to put that out there just to show you that this is not without difficulty in doing this sort of work, but it's very, very important because as a person who worked in the corporate world for years and years, there's an old expression: you can't manage what you don't measure. And I'm really seeking to create that kind of analytic framework and empirical data to help people make better decisions, both about the purchase decisions that they make and helping, I think, game publishers make better choices in terms of workflows, diversity of teams, and really thinking consciously about their audience, which is diverse. And, from a strictly from a marketing perspective, if you're just looking at it from a crass sort of neoliberal perspective, why would you want to leave people off the table? Why would you want to exclude people from this cultural practice, this tremendous hobby, when you can invite more people in and it's just better for everyone? So thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate the interest. This is my contact information. This is me on Twitter. This is my Ryerson email address. And you can visit my website, tanyapopodaphd.com, to learn more about some of the other projects that I'm working on. And I really, really want to thank you for listening. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great day.